December 20th, 1943, turned out to be abnormally cold in the skies over northern Germany. At an altitude of 8,000 meters, the temperature dropped to minus 60 degrees Celsius. In this rarefied, icy air, any open space became a deadly trap, and metal became as brittle as glass. It was here, in this silent and hostile space, that the finale of a mission unfolded. A mission that was supposed to be a triumph for American aviation, but instead turned into a bloodbath. A lonely B-17 bomber, bearing the proud name Olde Pub, resembled a wounded beast, crawling toward home with its last bit of strength. Lieutenant Charlie Brown's plane was no longer the formidable flying fortress that had left the airfield in England that morning. Now it was a flying sieve. One engine had been completely ripped away by an anti-aircraft shell, leaving nothing but charred wreckage. The second engine was choking on oil and smoking, putting out only a fraction of its power. The nose glass was shattered to pieces, and an incoming stream of icy wind at hundreds of kilometers per hour roared into the cockpit, turning everything inside to ice. For 21-year-old Charlie Brown, this was his first combat mission as an aircraft commander. A young farmer from West Virginia, he had barely adjusted to the weight of the control wheel when the full fury of the Third Reich descended upon him. Bremen, their mission's target, met the Americans with a wall of death, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns that turned the sky into a solid mess of black explosions. Even before the bombs left the bays, Olde Pub took a direct hit to the nose. The oxygen system failed, the hydraulics were severed, and a pink fluid, mixing with the blood of the wounded, instantly froze on the fuselage floor, turning it into a skating rink. Inside the plane, a nightmare was unfolding that cannot be described by the dry words of military reports. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, died in the very first minutes of the battle. His position was literally blown to bits by the cannons of German fighters. The rest of the crew were seriously wounded. Flight engineers tried to bandage their comrades with frostbitten hands, while the icy wind howled through holes in the skin large enough for a grown man to walk through. Charlie Brown himself was wounded by a shard in his shoulder. From loss of blood and lack of oxygen, he periodically fell into unconsciousness, and the plane would begin to fall into a deadly spiral. Only by an incredible effort of will did he pull the machine out of death's grip time and time again, holding it above the clouds. At that very same time on the ground at Jagdstaffel 27 near Bremen, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler was finishing refueling his Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 variant. Stigler was a veteran in the harshest sense of the word. Behind him was Africa and hundreds of combat sorties. He was an ace, with 27 confirmed victories to his name. But this day was special for him. According to Luftwaffe rules, Franz was only one four-engine bomber short of receiving the Knight's Cross, an award that in 1943 Germany made a man a living legend. Stigler saw the smoking fortress from afar, a lonely, helpless silhouette against the gray sky. To him, it was easy prey, a gift kill. He jumped into the cockpit, started the engine, and within a few minutes he was overtaking the American. Franz professionally approached the bomber's tail, right where the tail gunner's deadly machine guns were usually located. He placed his finger on the trigger, waiting for return fire. But the guns of Olde Pub were silent. They stared down lifelessly, covered in frost and clotted blood. Franz moved closer. At a distance of 50 meters, he saw something that made his finger freeze. Through the gaping holes in the tail and sides, he saw the interior of the plane. He saw bloodied men who were not trying to fight, they were simply trying to survive. He saw the dead gunner. He saw how the pilot in the cockpit was struggling not with the enemy, but with gravity itself, trying to keep this piece of tortured metal in the air. In Stigler's mind at that moment, the face of his mentor, the great ace Gustav Rodel, flashed. Before being sent to Africa, Rodel told his students, "You are fighter pilots, But if I ever find out that any of you shot at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. You fight by a code of honor, or you don't fight at all." To Franz, this crippled B-17 had become that very man in a parachute. To shoot them now would not be a victory, it would be an execution, the murder of the defenseless. Instead of pulling the trigger, Stigler did the unthinkable. He added throttle and pulled up right next to the cockpit on the right side. Charlie Brown, barely seeing through the frosted glass, turned his head and froze. Next to him, at arm's length, flew a gray Messerschmitt with black crosses. Brown saw the German pilot's eyes. He saw the rivets on his machine. He was certain these were the last seconds of his life. He closed his eyes and prepared to die. But death did not come. Franz Stigler began to gesture frantically. He shouted, though he could not be heard over the roar of the engines. He pointed down for Brown, urging him to land at a German airfield. He realized that with such damage, crossing the North Sea was impossible. The plane would simply fall apart in the air, or the crew would freeze to death. Stigler offered them life in exchange for captivity. But Charlie Brown, in a state of shock, saw only a threat in the German's gestures. He stubbornly shook his head and continued to hold his course to the west. Then Franz took an even crazier step. He realized the Americans would not surrender. Ahead on their course lay the coastline, the Atlantic Wall. The Reich's most powerful anti-aircraft batteries were located there, which would have turned the smoking bomber into ash in seconds. And then the German ace made a decision that was officially considered high treason. He tucked in tight against Ye Olde Pub, wing to wing. He became a human shield. When they passed over the coastal batteries, the German gunners below were in complete confusion. They saw through their binoculars how their own fighter was escorting the enemy. They did not dare open fire on the American, risking hitting their own hero, their own ace. Stigler literally led the enemy by the hand out from under his own artillery's fire. They flew like this for several minutes, an incredible duo, breaking every conceivable law of war. The German hunter and his American victim. When the infinite blue of the North Sea appeared under the wings, Stigler realized he had done everything he could. His fuel was running low, and if he flew much further, he wouldn't make it back to base himself. Franz looked at Charlie Brown one last time. A strange, almost mystical connection was established between them, a connection between two people who, in the epicenter of a global catastrophe, decided to remain human. Stigler raised a gloved hand and gave a sharp military salute. It was a sign of the highest respect for the crew's courage and an acknowledgement of their right to live. The German fighter broke away sharply into a turn and disappeared into the clouds, leaving the crippled fortress alone over the icy abyss of the ocean. Franz was heading back, knowing that if the truth of his act came out, a tribunal and execution awaited him. And Charlie Brown continued to fly forward, not yet knowing that this day would be the beginning of a secret he would keep for 40 years. When the gray silhouette of Franz Stigler's Messerschmitt dissolved into the leaden clouds over the coast, a haunting silence fell aboard Ye Olde Pub. It was broken only by the agonized howl of the icy wind and the intermittent coughing of the two remaining engines. Charlie Brown continued to grip the control wheel with numb fingers, staring into the void of the horizon where the sky merged with the sea. The psychological shock that the enemy, who just a second ago held their lives on the tip of his finger, had simply flown away, was so great that the crew could not utter a word for several minutes. They were left alone over the North Sea, a space that, in December 1943, offered no chance of rescue. Every kilometer of this journey was a struggle with death. Without the escort of the German ace, the plane became vulnerable again, but now its main enemy was physics itself. Due to the colossal damage to the tail and fuselage, the B-17 constantly tried to fall into a left bank. Brown and his co-pilot, Spencer Luke, leaned on the wheel together, using the last of their strength to keep the machine in level flight. Oil from the damaged engines coated the windshield, turning the view into a blurry smear. The wounded in the waist compartment groaned, their blood froze on the floor, and every jolt of the plane caused bouts of unbearable pain. But the hope, given by the strange German pilot, gave them the strength to continue this impossible flight. When the chalk cliffs of Norfolk appeared on the horizon, the crew could not believe their eyes. Ye Olde Pub literally reached the runway on a wing and a prayer and the last drops of fuel. The landing was hard, the brakes did not work, and the mangled bomber stopped only at the very end of the strip, shrouded in smoke. When the ground crews ran to the plane, they froze in horror. They did not understand how this frame, in which they later counted more than 200 holes, could have crossed the ocean at all. But Charlie Brown's story amazed them even more. Intelligence officers conducting the debriefing listened to the lieutenant with growing concern. The story of a good German did not fit the realities of total war. The command of the 6th Air Wing made a decision immediately. All details of the incident were classified as top secret. Charlie Brown and his surviving comrades were directly ordered, "Forget about it. This never happened. We cannot let our boys think that there are knights on the other side. We need them to hate the enemy, not look for compassion in his eyes." Thus, the story of Franz Stigler was buried in the archives for long decades. Meanwhile, on the other shore in occupied Europe, Franz Stigler landed at his airfield. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he stepped out of the cockpit. In the headquarters, he reported dryly, "Enemy bomber shot down over the sea. Cannot confirm the crash due to lack of fuel." It was a lie that could have cost him his head. Every time the talk in the Luftwaffe mess turned to honor and knight's crosses, Franz felt a coldness inside. He knew he had done something more than just shoot down a plane. He had saved his soul, but the price of this victory was a constant fear of exposure. He lived through the rest of the war, seeing his country crumble and his fellow pilots perish, and every day he wondered, did that B-17 make it? Did those wounded boys ever see their families? Years passed. The war ended in shame and ruins for Germany. Franz Stigler, who lost almost everything in that fire, immigrated to Canada in the early 50s. He became a simple mechanic, living modestly, trying not to remember his past as a Luftwaffe ace. At the same time, in America, Charlie Brown built his life, became a successful businessman, and raised children. But the ghost of that flight haunted both men. Charlie could not shake the sense of debt to a man whose face he hadn't even fully seen. He began to suffer from nightmares in which the gray Messerschmitt pulled in behind him again and again, but this time pulled the trigger. In 1986, as an elderly veteran, Charlie Brown decided he could no longer remain silent. He began his own investigation, which seemed insane. He had no name, no unit number, only a date and a type of aircraft. He began writing to West German archives and veteran associations, publishing open letters in magazines for former pilots. In one such letter, he wrote, "I am looking for the man who spared my crew on December 20th, 1943. I just want to say thank you." After 4 years of searching, in Canada, Franz Stigler opened his mailbox and saw a letter from the U.S. Air Force Veterans Association. When he read the text of Charlie Brown's advertisement, the tears he had held back for 40 years finally burst from his eyes. He sat down at his table and wrote a reply that began with the words, "I was that pilot. All these years I have often thought of you and prayed that you reached England." Their meeting took place in Miami in 1990. It was not just a meeting of two veterans. In the hotel lobby, the families of both pilots gathered, the children and grandchildren of Charlie Brown, who would not have been born if not for Stigler's gesture. When the two old men saw each other, time seemed to stop. Between them there was no politics, no borders, and no old enmity. Charlie Brown walked up to Franz and simply embraced him. At that moment, all the tension they had carried for nearly half a century vanished. Stigler, looking at Brown's large family, softly said, "Now I see that I didn't pull the trigger for a reason. This is my knight's cross." It turned out that over the decades of silence, both had become completely different people, but that moment in the sky remained the central point of their lives. They became best friends. For the next 18 years, they were inseparable. They went fishing together and spoke to young cadets together, telling them that in war, the most important thing is not the ability to kill, but the ability to remain human. They passed away almost at the same time, as if their lives were connected by an invisible thread stretched in the sky over Bremen. Franz Stigler died in March 2008 at the age of 92. Charlie Brown survived him by only 7 months, passing away in November of the same year. In the obituaries that went around the world's newspapers, they were mentioned not as former enemies, but as brothers. The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown will forever remain in human history as a reminder that even in the very heart of hell, amid the smoke and fire of the most terrible war, there is a place for mercy. Franz did not just save an American plane. He proved that one man making a choice in favor of kindness can change the fates of dozens of people for generations to come. The answer to the question of whether it was worth it is hidden in the smiles of Charlie Brown's children and grandchildren, who live in peace today only because one day a German ace decided not to shoot.